morning, everybody. It's your friendly neighborhood jazz shepherd. There's new merch at my merchandise store. This is a collection of sheep with various jazz labels, logos. They're members of the herd. Things have flocked together. It's a cool shirt on the back. It states I've been collecting vinyl since 1991, which obviously I have been. I had vinyl before that, but it was a separate thing, and I lost that stuff and I started over. In 1991, after a large CD collection had been stolen from me, and I didn't want to have to go rebuy all this classic rock stuff I bought on CD, coming out of my metal days, you know, Stones, Hot Rocks, Simon Garfunkel collected works, the Beatles, the White Album, the Red and Blue albums on CD. They were all $30+, which I guess $50 today, you know, and they all got stolen living in the east side, rough part of South Minneapolis back in 1991. And I went to a record store looking for my CDs, which wasn't that far down the road, and nothing was there, of course, but they had all the stuff I had stolen used on vinyl. And I didn't have any vinyl at the time, but I had vinyl as a child, and the stereo I was renting to own from a local rent-a-center had a turntable on top that I had never used, but it was there. And I was like, I already have a turntable. It's nothing special, but I just want to hear these Simon Garfunkel tracks, and honestly, hearing Simon Garfunkel with a little snap, crackle, and warmth to me only added to the charm. Same with old Stones, Hot Rocks tracks. Those songs sound great on vinyl. They just feel at home in that setting. And a lot of that stuff's not really even meant to be audiophiliac. It's not super compositionally challenging or instrumentally dazzling. It's just a groove, a feel, a riff, and the warmth of the record, the snap and the crackle actually can add some character and charm. But so yeah, vinyl, this collection, the sheep. This is just the jazz labels, of course. My collection goes a lot further than just jazz. But today we're going to have a fun episode. We are going to discuss 5 things that make jazz unique, special, and something that I love dearly. It's a bit of a fluid thing, you know, and some of the stuff obviously we've talked about, but I think they're all unique to jazz in some ways. We're listening to a fun Prez meets Vice Prez, Lester Young and Paul Kinnichet, or Kinnichet. I've heard it said both ways. If you notice on the cover, their faces have been drawn rather artistically. And I made a comment when I posted that record to my Facebook yesterday, how there was racial considerations being made. And a lot of black musicians didn't get their face on the cover of their record. They got drawn like such a thing, especially like an RCA, even Emerson Mercury, Capitol, or they got a hot white chick on the cover. You wanted to be careful with how you presented black music. And it wasn't necessarily a racism on the part of the record labels or the executives who hired these black musicians. It was more a consideration of the audience out there and hoping as many people would possibly be interested in buying it and not be put off by a black face on the cover. So it's not saying the labels are racist. They're just considering the fact that a lot of Americans were and are. So, and it's not something you can escape. It's ever present. It's an ever present thing. So the 5 things about jazz that I think are most unique, and I think this is just from my perspective, and these are my opinions. And some people have an issue like, oh, your opinions aren't. Of course they're not. They're my opinions. They're not meant to be the final say on anything. This is just my take and my perception. If you're watching this for a Christ-like declaration of how things are supposed to be, I can't help you. I'm not here to fucking instruct imperial law. I'm just giving you my insight from my experience in life and how I see things through the lens of history and geography, and these are my conceptions. You know, some people think that to give an opinion, you're being too imperial. On YouTube, how dare you give an opinion? It's like, that's part of what this channel is. It's a conversational channel. It's a thought-provoking channel. It's not just a how to You know what I mean? It's not just that type of experience, nor do I want it to be. But number one, most interesting thing about sprawl to me, about jazz to me, is, and these aren't really necessarily from 1 to 5 in order, but the sprawl of jazz. You can get into a band like Boston, you can get into a band like a Radiohead, and end up with 50, 100 records. And you start adding solo work and EPs and 7 inches and greatest hits and live records. It just sprawls, you know. But for the most part, if you're a completist, or even someone who wants to know the story and the history of a group, most rock and roll, R&B isn't that complicated to dig into. You know, with Zeppelin, you can really get by with the 8, maybe 10 with the live album and Coda records that covers their body of work. And it's pretty finite. And you can, of course, add some of the box sets and a few bonus tracks here and there, you know. But for the most part, Led Zeppelin made 8 records, you know. And it's some outtakes on Coda and Song Remains the Same, which one of the great rock live records of all time, soaked in the blues, soaked in the Black American experience, coming through the lens of a couple of white British cats who play it well. You know, I mean, no question about it. Jimmy Page and Robert Plant knew the blues and played it well. But they certainly didn't tend to give a lot of credit, at least not financially, to their sources. But the sprawl of jazz is so incredible. And if you can just be disconnected from it and buy a half dozen jazz records and just have them for color and atmosphere in your home when the time permits, more power to you. And that's not how I do it. Once I get into something, I have curiosity, questions, and I want to make connections and understand context. And when you start diving into jazz, no matter what your doorway in is, it's going to sprawl. And due to the label, the nature of the labels, the nature of the sidemen, the ever-changing nature of sidemen, the proliferation of sidemen into leaders themselves, you come in at, say, Miles Davis or Art Blakey, you are going to find out about another dozen musicians real quickly. And then it's going to become 2 dozen a few months later. And then it's going to be 3 dozen a few months after that. Next thing you know, you're collecting Red Garland and Bobby Timmons. And those records will start pushing you into the sidemen on those records. And suddenly you get to a point where you get deep enough into that cave that, boy, if I'm just going to collect all these Blue Note records, I might as well just collect the label itself, which in some ways is an umbrella group. And a lot of the labels have that kind of, and they have the little number sequences on them, so you get sucked into collecting them like baseball cards, but you can listen to them, and they're telling you something. And so the sprawl of jazz, I don't think there's anything like it in rock or soul, hip-hop, the Wu-Tang. You can get into the Wu-Tang, and the sprawl of the Wu-Tang Clan will take you 40 albums, CDs, you know, and you're like, wow, that's a lot of Wu-Tang. It's nothing compared to the Art Blakey universe. You know, it's nothing compared to the John Coltrane, Miles Davis universe, the Count Basie universe. These universes are so big and so sprawl through the fabric of jazz that you end up listening to Joe Newman 10 years later, you know, Charlie Shavers, because you realize that everything kind of links and has connections. And there's not a lot of jazz that exists outside of these connections. And one of the issues that people have with me sometimes is with the race, black versus white. It's incredible how extricated the black and white universes are in the 50s especially. The labels, the sidemen, the concerts, it's very racially divided. And as someone who's looking for those connections and that sprawl and those spider webs, I'm here to tell you right now, there's this massive spider web of white jazz and this massive spider web of black jazz. One sold well and charted well at the time. One wasn't distributed very well and sold poorly at the time. One has now fallen into disregard and hardly has any collectors. One has become incredibly collectible and full of noteworthy posterior artists in hindsight. But they didn't commingle a lot. For the most part, there's very much a separation between these two worlds. And the sprawl of jazz, as sprawl as it doesn't cross racial lines like people want to think it does. And sure, there was those bridges and those innovations were being made, but it didn't make it ever commonplace. And even in the 60s, most records are, for the most part, targeting a white audience, targeting more of a jazz purist audience. A lot of the White Cat records on RCA, Capitol, Columbia don't mind having a black bass player, maybe a black drummer, O.C. Johnson or something, but it's not commonplace to have just intermingled black and white horns. And it does happen. It happens more and more as we get into the 60s, where Newman and Al Cohn, those guys will start working together. But it's not this everyday experience of the jazz universe. So the sprawl is one way I can illustrate for people how divergent these worlds were and how seldom they really intersect. So the sprawl of jazz, I think, is very unique, and no other really music genre that I'm familiar with does it. Maybe classical has some of that with different symphonies doing a lot of the same composers' pieces, and so but I'm not very schooled on that subject. But for me, jazz is a really unique thing as a collector, and once you go down that wormhole, there's other universes out there, baby, and you start falling into those places. Number 2 on my list. I find this very unique to jazz. How different I can interpret the same record or song upon each listen. Unlike pop and rock and even reggae, they're going to tell me a similar story every time I listen to it, and it's going to put me in a similar headspace every time I hear it, and who I am is going to be part of that interpretation. But it's always going to be, at the end of life, it's always going to put me in Blackbird and Lancashire, counting the holes in the streets, climbing up on a double-decker bus, putting a comb through my hair. Like, I can't really escape the lyrical content of a pop song. You can put it in its context and understand what's, the machine behind it. And you do that with British and American, and you understand. But you still, the lyric and the shape of a pop song, it kind of puts you in that same, the Grateful Dead. I'm a huge Dead fan. But when I listen to Grateful Dead, I see little turtles dancing in the forest in a half-medieval setting where there's hippies and medieval people drinking mead together, dancing with little happy bears. They take everything, country, roots, the blues, the raw material, they throw it into the Grateful Dead pot, and it comes back out with that Dead sound, with Garcia's interesting scales and approaches. What an incredible player Garcia is, just all storyteller feeling. He's a bard, and when they have Brent Midland in the group, and they have that second voice of real strength, because both Bobby and Jerry's voices are Jerry is weak and frail often, and Bobby's got a decent voice, but he sings like me. He's got a lot of feel, but he doesn't really have the cleanness of tone or melodic offsets. Brent Midland really brought that to the crew. But the different interpretations of jazz to me is so interesting. A jazz track can be completely different each listen in terms of where my headspace is, which kind of ties into number 3 on my list, is how a lot of that interpretation is based on my mood, my state of mind, my understanding, and my empathy. And that's a very important key. It's something that's open to interpretation. It's going to inflect our intellect, our empathy, our understanding, our mood, mindset, our whatever frame of mind we're in. A Day in the Life by the Beatles is going to be pretty much a day in the life regardless of my mindset, even my empathy versus my friend or roommate's empathy. We're going to hear Stairway to Heaven kind of the same way. War Pigs kind of the same way. The Wu-Tang Clan is going to come off kind of the same way. But with jazz, what I'm sitting and thinking and feeling in my corner of the room, across the room might be someone else hearing it and thinking something totally different. So it's very open to interpretation, to imagination, to our level of empathy and perception, and empathy and understanding are interwoven. The more we understand something, the more empathy we have for the people in that situation, the more we can be willing to step into their circumstance and try to grasp what they're telling us. To be separate from an artist is to not really have any insight into an artist. So and understanding, to understand the history of a people helps us understand what that art has to say. When you understand the history of the Israelites, when John's writing the book of Revelation in exile on Patmos, he's talking about the fall of Rome and the freedom of his people someday, and there's going to be a judgment day coming. Bob Marley often talks about the little fish that gets eaten down by the big fish. Someday, that small axe is going to come along and cut down that big tree. The power to the oppressed. That message has such a ring to it, and it fuels a lot of the great art throughout time. And Rage Against the Machine streams that System of a Down. They all stream that same, you've been stepping on me, but someday you are going to get stepped on. And 50 years from now, 500 years from now, someone's going to stand up and be like, oh, I hear that. Can I get some of that? Because I need some of that with me in my situation. And so jazz and empathy, it's such an interwoven perception machine. And so you couple that with how you can interpret it different every time. One day I might be angry and feeling politically and socially conscious and hearing things and perceiving things in my mind that I might not catch the next day when I'm sitting there kind of lazy with one eye open, thinking about I want to be on the side of a street with a cafe and a baguette and a cup of coffee going, I'm so sophisticated. And part of the problem, I think, with a lot of jazz listeners and why they take umbrage with what I say, I just use the word umbrage, love it, is because they want to think of it as an intellectual experience, an intellectual delivery. And that the only thing that these musicians are focused on is my intellectualism, my virtuosity, listen to how sophisticated and modern I am, how unique. And I don't think very many musicians approach their playing that way. And that goes across all spectrums of music. Musicians are mostly trying to express feelings, emotions, and experiences. And I think the intellectual crowd who populates a lot of the jazz consumer base doesn't want to feel challenged by someone saying this music isn't about how sophisticated you are in comprehending it. That's a group of people that doesn't like to be challenged in any kind of level in any way. Just the fact of that matter. The intellectuals who consume jazz are too well educated to be teachable or to even have suggestions be open to them. Their minds of perception, they've closed those doors. And that's unfortunate because it's not just an intellectual essay expressing, even Coltrane, Giant Steps. There was mathematics and numbers behind that, no question. He abandons the blues and completely dissects the concepts of music and scales and how it's all approached. Yet he still delivers it with an emotional context that makes it function. If it was just the numbers, it wouldn't have its power. So there's no question that there is intellectuality in a lot of what these musicians are dissecting, but they're just looking for new pavement to pour to express new realms of their sorrow and experience. So again, that whole my perception from one time to the next and who I am and where I'm at, how that impacts my listening, jazz is very unique in that level. It doesn't have a lot of comparison for me. Number 4 is jazz has this coded message, and I've talked about this numerous times, and it's part of what the last 2 things we're saying, but there's such a urgency to a lot of it that's spoken completely in code, spoken completely in emoting. And when you hear an Eddie Lockjaw Davis expressing some great sorrow or historical wail, and then Johnny Griffin comes in with his powerful roller coaster of notes and spewing of lava, my slow-moving molten rock, and his fiery, pumice-laden, fury boiling. It has this thing, it has this power. And it's just a documentation that's coming in code And it requires a lot of understanding to break coded messages. And that's part of the whole process of jazz, is getting to understand where all this is coming from. And a lot of people criticize the Ken Burns documentary unfairly, I feel. I'm not saying you have to love everything that every one of those guys says all the time. The guy that just passed away recently, he ruffles a lot of feathers. I don't think he's that outlandish in most of what he says, but he does drive some ire and irk in some people for sure. I can't think of his name right now. You can see his face, the gray beard, the glass. Oh man, tip of my tongue. But I think Winton's on point with almost everything he says in that. I think it's a great diving in point, and it certainly does focus on the Ellingtons, Armstrongs, Bassies. You know, Miles gets pretty good coverage. Billie Holiday. It covers, that era somewhat more. But it does set the table socially, politically, and culturally. You do see the difference between the white experience and the black experience, and how much that colors and shapes a lot of the history and the music. It just does. And a friend of mine who commented yesterday with a great comment, he was talking about my episode the other day, and he's like, I don't understand how people don't get it. Paul's Boutique by the Beastie Boys and NWA, Straight Outta Compton, are both highly considered hip-hop classic records. They're both still regarded highly. And they so tell different stories. Through the same medium and art form, there's no way you could have the Beastie Boys talking about what NWA talked about. That's just not part of their experience. You know what I mean? They're talking about Eggman. They're kind of silly, yet great at the same time. Looking down the barrel of a gun, I doubt they'd ever done that. I don't think they knew anything about that. Paul's Boutique is a great record with a lot of hip-hop, low royalty sampling, Johnny Royale. It's even the sources of a lot of that stuff, Beatles and Dylan and just weird, like Bob Marley. There's a lot of weird samples and sources that an NWA probably wouldn't have even gone near. And there's no way NWA could have gone into the studio and made Johnny Royale and the Eggman and came off without any integrity. They both spoke from their experience, their place of living, and emoted that into their art form. And because of the lyrical content, it makes it easier for us to digest and go, oh, they're having different experiences. But for some reason, we go back 40 years, and a jazz guy wants to tell us something, and somehow we don't get that what he's saying is different from what the white guy's saying. How can we not equate that? There's not any way they're just sitting back and trying to show off their skill sets and be like, oh, look how sophisticated and modern my modal approach is. That's just not how it works. And I'm always amazed how many people come away from some of these episodes thinking that I don't like white jazz. I have more white jazz records than most of y'all. I mean, I filled in the Savoy white jazz, the Argo white, all these labels. The anonymous level of white jazz players, it's infinite. And a lot of them sold well back in the day, and they're kind of completely obscure now. I love a lot of white jazz players, but I don't ever sit back and get these tingles on my arm thinking, well, oh my God, what a tough life these people must have experienced. My empathy doesn't allow it. My understanding doesn't allow that for me even be how I can hear Chet Baker's sorrow at times, but to me, like I said, all he's saying is, God, I want to get high. And that's part of me knowing his story, which is part of what understanding is. I know your story, your background, your environment, your experience of that. So now I have some idea of what you're telling me. And if you can go through that process of knowing a person's personality, his upbringing, and the climate that upbringing was in, and not factor that into what that musician's telling you, it's like saying Eddie Van Halen and Tony Iommi are saying the same thing. They're not. And they're the same race. So I get a little confused at times how people can be so, again, it's intellectualism. Oh, I think jazz is just about the sophisticated playing, and it's intellectual, and I'm intellectual, so I want to sit back and listen to Jimmy Joffrey do all this. I don't know why you have to. I'm not insulting nothing. I love Jimmy Joffrey. I got most of his material up to about 1966 or so, as with most artists. Why can't jazz make a good album cover post 1965? I don't understand that. What happens? It just goes. Pfft. Best album covers are jazz. 50, 10-inch era, 56, LP era. You know what I mean? 65. All of a sudden, jazz becomes this afterthought commercially, and the marketing department's going, fuck that. Just paste something and we'll type something on it. It goes from being so innovative and brilliant to just being the worst album covers in the industry overnight. Blue Note, post Liberty buyout, their covers go to shit instantly. And they still made some good music at that point. Some of the covers are better than others, but there's some awful covers in Blue Note once Liberty takes over. And they didn't make a bad cover for 10 years. Not one. How do you... I don't think they paid Reed Miles that great anyway. And so I don't think they couldn't have hired another art director and paid them the same money they were paying Reed Miles. From what I understood, Reed Miles was getting pretty underpaid by Blue Note to do it. And he still did it. Burt Goldblatt, I'm going to do an episode on him coming up. He makes some of the most awesome album covers in the industry. I love Burt Goldblatt's work. And it's pretty sprawling how many labels he worked for. Unlike Reed Miles, is pretty much Blue Note with a few other labels sprinkled in. Burt Goldblatt's everywhere. A few labels really use him a lot, but he's probably on 25 different labels that in my research so far. I probably have about 150 Goldblatt covers, I bet. So it's going to be interesting to see them all. He's definitely has a few styles he works with, which Reed Miles did as well. And I think they kind of borrow from each other a little bit at times. I'd like to know which one of them did the single tone cover with one color kind of tone with the photograph. Who did that first? And like I said, jazz is in front of the curve with all graphic design and album covers. And so certainly it's jazz that does it. And it's really labels like Roost and Bethlehem that start doing artistic covers, and that's Goldblatt. You know, right off the bat, Storyville, like he's doing some really cool covers early in 53, probably even 52. Blue Note doesn't have Reed Miles yet. But Reed Miles is by no way just biting Goldblatt. Reed Miles does some stuff that has elements of Goldblatt, but he certainly goes his own direction with a lot of the innovations he makes. There's nothing quite like what Reed Miles does, and there's no graphic design from any label or even artist throughout time in the music industry that managed to make a more timeless set of packagings. So many of those Blue Note album covers look like they could be on some alternative rock record that came out last week. Oh, look, Mars Volta has a new record, or whoever, you know. Oh, look, you know, a bunch of question marks, and it's some of it's so graphically timeless. And there's probably lessons to be learned in that, but we won't dive into that right now. And so, the last thing I want to share about jazz, I think, is really unique. And I think all music does us to some degree, is the correction of hindsight. And pop music has a lot of the fluffy kind of imitation innovation, the ones who copy innovation. A lot of that stuff tends to fall by the wayside. And it's the innovators and the real powerful, driving, fresh voices in pop and rock and R&B that kind of tend to get remembered more so. But I don't think anything has the kind of corrective lensing that jazz has had. And as I mentioned earlier, in the 50s, into the 60s, the jazz polls, the jazz charts, album sales were dominated completely by white artists. And if you were to look at one of those Playboy polls I showed you last month, it's 80% white guys, and only 20% of those guys you even know nowadays. They've really slipped off into obscurity, and they were the benefactors of having more money and distribution behind them at the time and being white. And hindsight has really shown that most of the great innovators in jazz were black. Most of the blues inflection comes from the black experience. So the stuff with the most feeling, the most integrity, the most guts, the most sweat, blood, and tears, it's going to be those black cats. And a lot of them lived in very much in obscurity at the time, and a lot of them have kind of ascended towards a level of greatness and reverence that they never got close to achieving in their careers. First and foremost, Hank Mobley, a guy that lives pretty much in obscurity through most of his career. And it's hard for us to kind of grasp now because he seems such a giant luminary to us who are like into that second, third level of jazz collecting. Your first level is going to be your Miles and Coltrane's. It's kind of the beginning Monk, you know. But once you get a few rungs deeper, Mobley becomes this figure that you're like, oh, he's revered by a lot. And he's wonderful because of his an honest, integral approach to his playing. He just has this sincerity and sweetness, and there's a tenderness to Mobley. Part of it, I feel like, is he's always willing to listen. And we look for that in conversation as people. We want to talk with someone who doesn't just talk, who wants to listen as well. And you didn't get to do a lot of talking when you played with John Coltrane. But for me, Mobley's a great listener. And he definitely seems to respond tonally, melodically, rhythmically, and even with volume that kind of is complementary to what you had to say and do. So Mobley is really a very interesting player in terms of his jazz universe. And he didn't sell well at all, which partly is what makes his Blue Notes go for thousands of dollars. He, by the 70s, was homeless and living on the streets for a while. I believe he makes a slight resurgence in the 80s, where he plays a few nightclubs and stuff, and has a little bit of a resurgence then. But he died penniless, from what I understand. A sad but not uncommon ending for the great black jazz musician. The white guys had union jobs in the film studios and TV studios, and the black guys die off in obscurity. Or a few maybe had some acclaim when they passed. Miles Davis certainly was fairly well recognized. Coltrane probably on some level. But a guy like Monk, as important as Monk was, he was not on Americans' tongues when he passed away. You know, he was pretty much, he was noticed. You know, I mean, there was some, but I don't feel like a guy like Monk gets the credit he deserves. You know, and he's as innovative as anybody in the music has ever been. You know, Monk's a really brilliant person. But the hindsight in jazz has seemed to really correct a lot of that, what money and race and politics had set in place. And a lot of the great black players were completely overshadowed or didn't sell or weren't distributed. There was no national perception of them. There wasn't a nation of people willing to even buy a lot of black music, especially not militant Blue Note stuff, you know, angry young Clifford Brown, Sonny Rollins, Max Roach. That stuff, it was too challenging for a lot of white America to digest. And like I said, you had to package a lot of it very carefully. Putting some brothers on a record, it's one thing for Embassy Mercury to do that. It's another thing putting their faces on the covers. I want to show you another record. Hold on. This is something I've seen a lot of, completing their label discographies. The more indie the label is, the more they're willing to show you a person's true appearance. I've seen it with Johnny Hartman, you know, or some of his more popular ABC titles. He's got makeup and just kind of really lightened. But here's a really, I think, stark example. I've had this Lurleen Hunter record for quite a long time. This is called Blue and Sentimental, Atlantic 1344, probably from 1959. A fantastic blues, gospel jazz singer, just wonderful record, okay? And it's pretty tough to come by, honestly. The other day I was stumbling on one of her records on RCA, if I recall, yeah. And this Lurleen record on Atlantic, probably cost you 40, 50, 60 bucks. When those same artists make records on labels like RCA, they'll cost you $2, $3, $4, $5 because A, they were sold so much greater, and B, the music's not as unwatered, it's more watered down. They try to make it a little bit more digestible for white America. And it's not just this is so obvious, but look at her here. She's probably a sister, but you're not sure. She could be Italian. She could be Israeli. Jew. Like it's meant to be obfuscated. Her racial tonality. You know what I mean? She could just be a dark-haired Mediterranean gal. You know what I mean? She could even be from the British Isles. She could be mixed with anything. You know, they lightened her up. The lighting is set in such a way, even her hair. It's very much a different Lurleen Hunter. And this one goes for $2-3. This one goes for $50-60. In no small part because of the labels. So labels do have a lot of story to tell us, and labels do very much cover up. And if people think it's not true, Miles Davis, as popular a Negro as this country made in jazz music, struggled all the time to get his face on the cover, to get his black wife on the cover. They wanted to put white women on there. They wanted to put a bull and a Spanish siesta. Like it's not like if Miles is having that struggle, Miles, with his well-paid contracts and his powerful sprawl of his universe and being the most prominent jazz name by the 60s, had to struggle to get a black face on his album covers on a major label. And it was a debatable thing constantly. I don't know. So anyway, those are the 5 things about jazz I think are quite unique. How hindsight's really corrected a lot of, well, it'd be the same as if we went back to the 1950s on television and now said that the 25 greatest shows were shows that nobody saw on networks that nobody really even followed. But they were such great, innovative shows. They obviously impacted all the other mainstream shows on ABC, CBS, and NBC. That's what jazz has done. It's gone back and said all the stuff that sold well, all the stuff that dominated the charts and the polls, none of it really has the importance, staying power, or the significance of these indie little black jazz artists who created the entire tablet. So that's a pretty unique thing. Like I said, the documentation history through code, I don't think, and of course, other art forms do it, but like hip hop and soul does it verbally, so it's not coded. The Book of Revelations was coded. Jazz is coded, and that's a pretty unique thing in music for me. Again, how it's based on our mood, our state, our empathy, our understanding. That's all, again, something that is unique to jazz. How each time you put it on, you might feel something different or hear something new, and it might take your mind into a new. And see, that's part of what I think people understand. A lot of where it comes from is just where does your train of thought go when you're listening to it, and that's where empathy, understanding, experience, mindset all comes into play. Because I'm not just sitting there going, okay, what is the musician doing numerically? I don't ever listen that way. And a lot of times I'm not even listening, trying to perceive it. I'm just on the computer typing something, looking up something, dealing with something. All of a sudden a little thing will ping on me. I'm like, oh, man, you forgot about what they were going. I mean, it'll just kind of send you down this thought process. And that thought process in jazz could be different every time depending on, like I said, it's really unique. I think it's fascinating. And of course, the sprawl of jazz, welcome to that endless universe. Once you dive in and you get past 100 jazz records, I'll see you at 5,000. You know what I mean? As money allows and as space allows, you will keep collecting because you'll never hit that point where the sprawl doesn't continue. You have to artificially put barriers in place, which I have done at times. You know what I mean? I'll say I'm not going to do certain errors, which I haven't. I'm not going to do certain labels. I'm going to focus on this and that. And then as you get to a point where you understand that what you put inside that fence, you open up a gate and add a few more new territories, and your understanding, comprehension, sprawl expands. But that new universe and black hole ends you up in a whole bunch of new comprehension and new artists and new labels, and it never ever ends. I'm here to tell you that it never ends. And I can get to places where I feel, okay, I'm good right now. You know what I mean? I'm good right now. But when I get to that place and I know I can't spend money for a while, I almost feel like I got to stop researching and learning because I'm compulsed when I learn about something new that I feel is significant or important to go and find it and buy it. That's just how it works. A lot of times in my episodes, I gotta buy 10 records because I'm like, oh, I need to have that. I don't want to talk about it and not own it. Who talks about something they don't know? It's not me. So sometimes I say I want to do an episode. I'm waiting to find a couple of records that I feel are important to have to do such said episode. And it never stops. You never get to a point where you tackle something like, oh, I have all the material I need for this. That Basie episode I did, the Basie universe, I thought I had everything, all the artists. But digging in, I'm like, I found at least 10 things. I'm like, oh, I need to have that. That's important. That's an important chapter in the Basie universe. And the guitar, same thing. You know, the labels, it's the same. It just keeps on sprawling and sprawling. And in some ways, I just love it because it's such an endless wellspring of knowledge and perception and comprehension and musicality and the development of the music itself. There's a lot of great things that we can sieve out of this music. Self-awareness, self-confidence, self-expression, self-prophetic, try to profess a positive future. A lot of jazz has that in it, where it's trying to recognize this mud that we live in, but it's saying we need to get to a place where we can all stand on firm ground. And so at the end of the day, positivity, overcoming challenges is a lot of what the racial components are addressing. It's not necessarily addressing the wrongdoings and the injustice and retribution, repercussions. It's not so much saying that. It's so much saying we need you to recognize what was done that was incorrect. So moving forward, we can do better. Because it hurts me and it hurt my children. And it hurt my grandfather way more. And so can we please start making progress? And it's hard, man, because there's an entire system in place that needs to keep us from making that progress. Because united in a democracy, we would have power. And they know it. They absolutely know it. And that if we all set race and religion and abortion and guns aside and said, you know what we all care about is healthcare, clean water, and good education, we would have that stuff. But we can't even bring those things to the table. Because whenever we try to, race flares up. Religion, abortion, guns, they all flare up. And don't think it's not interwoven. Don't think they're not conscious of that. They will distract us with whatever they have to prevent the change from coming that needs to happen. So we're up against insurmountable odds. It's so much deeper than the mindset of the average white American. Because that average white American's mindset is being set by dictation, by what they see on the television every day. If we could take the television out of the equation, we'd make progress. You know, but every time we take a few steps forward, sometimes even via television, we make progress. That same medium can take us 2 steps back with that same proliferation of a message. And the unity of television is so insane because we feel like there's a polarity between the left and right in America, but yet the left and right are really just singing harmony to the same melody. And they're both really creating the discourse and the disconnect equally. It's not like just one side's raving mad, crazy, and confused and disillusioned. You know what I mean? Have the wool pull over their eyes. Both sides are equally guilty of being divided and unwilling to listen and polarized by sensationalism. And that's just got to come to a stop. That's just got to... We have to stop looking at the ground around us in my immediacy and allowing that to be my perception of self. Because the understanding of who we are and our purpose and place in this world exists out there in the cosmos. The stars, the heavens, the distant galaxies, somewhere out there are the clues we need to find to help us go, oh, that's who and what we are. It doesn't exist here in this plane. It's certainly not on the television. And no one have a clue of it. You know, so the philosophies of man aren't going to take you very far. I spent a lot of time watching astronomy late at night. There's so much innovation in astronomy daily, monthly, weekly. It's Hubble, what it's done for our perceptions. the Hubble deep field image and the ultra deep field image, how that one little cube of space, when they focused that camera there for weeks, ended up showing galaxies 12, 13 billion light years away as the light slowly reached us. That's mind-numbing. It's mind-numbing. And when we see our little fragile blue marble circling that ball of fire in this vulnerable black vacuum of space, and we share this little paradise together, how can we be at each other's throats as much as we are? It's one thing when we were trying to fight over a fire stick and a leg of mammoth, but we got a lot of that basic stuff covered. We should be doing so much better. As long as we're divided by the perils of earthly woe and not seeing ourselves as one humanity that needs to work in unison to make this a better planet for all, so we can eradicate war, disease, hunger. But they can't have us seeing that. And that's the problem with education. Education, you have too many people having understanding and empathy. So we got to dumb down that curriculum. My kids, one's a senior, grade 12, the other's in grade 10, the amount of understanding that they get through school is so disturbingly minimal. And that's not to say my kids pay the most attention in the world, because they don't. But my kids have struggling with, they can't do multiplication. My kid's a senior. And if you ask him what 5 times 5 is, he'll go 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus on his hand. And I've tried to reteach them that stuff many times over the years, giving them little tables. Kind of get it, but then they'll forget it because they never have to use it. They can't write. They just type. They don't know how to write by hand. They don't have cursive anymore. They can't read cursive. It's insane how they've shaped our place in the world to just be good little consumers that go to work without complaining and thinking that this is what freedom is. I'm out. Hope you have a great weekend. I got some fun episodes coming down the channel. Hope you enjoyed those 5 things about jazz that I think are unique to jazz, at least on some levels. Y'all be safe. Peace.